Ladies and gentlemen, hold on to your seats because the Toronto Blue Jays are in absolute chaos right now, and we're not talking about the typical spring training drama that gets blown out of proportion by excited fans counting down the days until opening day. No, this is different. This is the kind of roster crisis that forces general managers to make midnight calls to scouts, that keeps front office executives up at night scribbling lineup combinations on cocktail napkins, and that could fundamentally reshape how this entire team looks when they take the field on opening day. And it all comes down to one man who was supposed to be a depth signing, a low-risk flyer on a guy who everyone thought had seen his best days in Major League Baseball. But folks, Eloy Jimenez has just forced the Toronto Blue Jays into an impossible decision, and the ripple effects of what happens next could determine whether this team contends or stumbles through another frustrating season. Here's what makes this situation so absolutely wild. Just a few months ago, Eloy Jimenez was essentially done. We're talking about a guy who nearly walked away from professional baseball altogether. Think about that for a second. This man, who once upon a time was a top prospect in baseball, who was crowned a Rookie of the Year finalist, who had the kind of upside that made scouts salivate, was genuinely considering hanging up his cleats and walking away from the game. The injuries, the off-field issues, the inconsistency, the battles with weight and conditioning, it all added up to a guy who looked like he was finished before he even turned 30. Most teams in baseball wouldn't touch him. Most organizations would look at his recent history and immediately pass. But the Blue Jays, in their infinite wisdom and willingness to take calculated risks, decided to give him a shot on a minor league contract. They said, "Sure, come to camp, show us something, and if you've still got it, we'll talk about the future." It was the kind of low-pressure, no-risk move that organizations make all the time in spring training, expecting nothing and hoping for a surprise. And then something extraordinary happened. Eloy Jimenez didn't just show up. He showed up transformed. According to the latest reports coming from multiple beat writers covering the team, Jimenez has completely overhauled his body composition. He's leaner, stronger, and more explosive than he's been in years. But more importantly, and this is the part that's sending shockwaves through the baseball world, he's absolutely crushing baseballs during spring training in a way that suggests his legendary power is back and better than ever. We're talking about a guy who just ripped a 109.4 mile per hour double in a game against Detroit. 109.4 miles per hour. For context, that's the kind of exit velocity that elite power hitters produce on a regular basis. That's not a fluke. That's not a one-off impressive moment. And when you look at his advanced analytics from spring training, everything points to the same conclusion. Eloy Jimenez appears to be the real deal again. The numbers are honestly staggering when you really sit down and analyze them. In his limited spring training plate appearances so far, Jimenez has recorded 4 hard-hit balls on just 5 total batted balls. That's an 80% hard-hit rate. To put that in perspective, the average MLB player hovers around 35 to 40% on hard-hit rates. We're talking about elite territory here. This isn't some fluke sample size of a couple at-bats. This is early evidence that Eloy Jimenez might actually be the guy who put up an 891 OPS back when he was healthy and focused. This is the kind of performance trajectory that could indicate he's turning back the clock to his best years, when he was consistently putting together seasons with an OPS well above 800 and truly elite production against left-handed pitching. Now here's where the situation becomes genuinely complicated and forces the Blue Jays' hand in ways they probably didn't anticipate when they signed him. The team is about a month away from having to submit their opening day roster. That's March 27th, folks, just around the corner. Between now and that date, the organization has to make some serious decisions. And all of a sudden, they have this problem on their hands. What do you do when a depth signing starts playing like a star? How do you fit a potentially elite left-handed hitting threat into a roster that's already completely full with players you've already committed to? Jimenez himself has actually been incredibly gracious about the whole situation. When asked about his future with the team, he didn't complain, didn't demand anything, didn't throw a tantrum, or threaten to leave. Instead, he said something that honestly made everyone in the baseball world respect him even more. He essentially said that he understands the roster math, that he's willing to start the season in AAA if that's what the Jays decide is best, and that he's just focused on continuing to put out elite-level performance every single day. His exact words were something along the lines of, "I don't want to focus too much on the future. Whenever they decide, I'm going to keep doing my thing. If they decide I need to go to another team, that's okay. If not, I'll stay here." That's the attitude of a professional who's been through the ringer and has finally found his peace. But here's the problem that his humble attitude doesn't solve. The Blue Jays now have to figure out how to utilize this talent, and the roster complications are absolutely real. Let's talk about the roster situation directly. The Blue Jays have a limited amount of space, and their outfield and DH situations are already pretty crowded. If Eloy Jimenez is going to make the opening day roster, that means somebody else probably doesn't make it. And suddenly, the organization finds itself in a position where they might have to move a player they've already invested significant resources into this offseason. The name that keeps coming up in trade speculation and roster speculation is David Schneider. Now, Schneider had a decent year last year with an OPS around 800. He led the team in walk rate at 15.9%. He's a solid enough player, and the Blue Jays have shown loyalty to him. But here's the thing, he's not exactly a must-keep player. If Eloy Jimenez continues to mash the way he has been, and if he proves he can be elite against left-handed pitching, then from a pure roster construction standpoint, you absolutely have to try to make room for him. Some analysts and former players covering the team have suggested that if the Jays go down the road of adding Jimenez to the opening day roster, the team could theoretically trade away David Schneider, option down Nathan Lucas, or find some other creative solution. But the reality is more nuanced than that. Nathan Lucas appears to be untouchable, not because he's an elite player, he's not, but because the organization has signaled a commitment to him, and multiple reports have indicated that they're not going to option him down just out of professional respect. Then you've got Miles Straw, who's their backup center fielder and also their primary defensive replacement. Straw is safe on the roster because he's their only viable backup at that premium defensive position, and frankly, the guy has one of the best clubhouse presences on the entire team, according to multiple sources from within the organization. He's not the most dominant hitter you'll ever see. In fact, he's well below average as a hitter by a wide margin. But his defense is pristine, and his presence in that clubhouse cannot be overstated in terms of team chemistry. So, when you look at the math, the only real option to make room for Eloy Jimenez appears to be David Schneider. And here's where it gets interesting. Schneider is not having a bad year by any stretch of the imagination. He's a solid player with an 800 OPS and a team-leading walk rate. He's not a guy you just want to casually move, but at the same time, if Eloy Jimenez is legitimately back and can produce elite numbers against left-handed pitching, which is supposed to be his specialty, then you're potentially looking at an upgrade that could impact your playoff chances. One baseball analyst who's been following this situation closely created some interesting potential lineup simulations showing how the Blue Jays could theoretically integrate both Eloy Jimenez and David Schneider into the same lineup. Against right-handed pitchers, the roster construction is pretty straightforward and doesn't really change whether or not Jimenez makes the team. You'd have Springer in right field, Clement at second base, Vlad Guerrero Jr. at first, Kazuma Okamoto at third, and Salvador Perez catching. That's a strong lineup against righties. But when you flip to the left-handed pitcher matchups, suddenly things get a lot more interesting and flexible. If both Jimenez and Schneider make the team, you could structure a lineup where Springer's in right field, Clement at second, Vlad at first, Okamoto at third, Kirk catching, Schneider getting a start, and then Eloy Jimenez as your designated hitter. It's feasible. It's workable. But it's also not exactly optimal because you're basically trying to fit two square pegs into round holes and hoping it all works out. Here's the uncomfortable truth that the Blue Jays front office has to grapple with. David Schneider, despite his respectable overall numbers, has not been the elite left-handed pitcher masher that everyone expected him to be when he was signed. There was this narrative that he would be a platoon specialist who absolutely crushes left-handed pitching and struggles against righties. But that's not what actually happened. He's actually been better against right-handed pitchers. So if you're going to have someone as your designated hitter against left-handed pitching, and you're choosing between a guy who's been mediocre against lefties versus a former star who appears to be rediscovering his power and his ability to absolutely devastate left-handed pitching, well, from a purely analytical standpoint, that decision should be pretty easy. The Blue Jays front office has made a lot of significant acquisitions this offseason. They've been relatively aggressive in trying to improve the roster from a team that finished pretty far out of contention last year. The biggest piece they lost was Bo Betts departing the team, and they've been trying to piece together improvements to replace that production. Kazuma Okamoto was brought in with hopes that he could provide some of that power that Betts provided. But frankly, nobody really thinks that Okamoto is going to get all the way there. He's got potential, but replacing exactly what Bo Betts gives you on a daily basis is essentially impossible. So the question becomes, where else can you find production and offensive firepower? And suddenly, this situation with Eloy Jimenez becomes incredibly valuable. If Jimenez can genuinely return to form and produce at a 750 to 800 OPS level, that's exactly the kind of production this team desperately needs. Let's step back for a second and appreciate the narrative here. We have a guy who was literally considering retirement a few months ago. We have someone who had nearly completely checked out of the game, who had allowed injuries and personal struggles to beat him down to the point where continuing to play professional baseball didn't seem worth it anymore. And now, through sheer determination, through completely transforming his body, through a renewed focus and a clear head, he's forced himself back into conversation as a potentially elite major league player. That's the kind of comeback story that Hollywood would turn into a sports movie. That's the kind of character arc that makes baseball beautiful and compelling. It's also important to note that Jimenez is planning to participate in the World Baseball Classic, which is coming up soon. This is another opportunity for him to showcase his talents on an international stage, to prove to himself and to the world that he's truly healthy and fully capable of elite performance. The World Baseball Classic always brings out the best in players because there's so much pride at stake, so much national honor involved. If Jimenez tears it up in the WBC, that only strengthens his case for making the Blue Jays roster and being a cornerstone piece of their lineup. So what's the likely scenario going forward? Based on everything we know, everything Jimenez himself has said, and the current state of the roster, the most probable outcome is that the Blue Jays opt to start Eloy Jimenez at AAA to begin the season, maintaining his minor league contract status and keeping him one call-up away from the majors. This allows the organization to keep their current roster intact without having to make difficult trades or controversial option decisions. It buys them time to see how things develop over the first few weeks of the season. It also respects Jimenez's stated willingness to start in the minors if that's what the team needs. But, and this is a huge but, if Eloy continues to mash in AAA the way he's been mashing in spring training, if those advanced metrics continue to look elite, if he proves that this resurrection is for real and not just a short spring training mirage, then the Blue Jays will absolutely be forced to bring him up and integrate him into the major league roster. And when that happens, somebody is going to have to move. Somebody is going to lose playing time or get shipped out. That's just the reality of baseball. The situation with David Schneider is probably the most realistic casualty if that scenario plays out. Not because Schneider is a bad player or because the front office secretly wants to move him, but simply because he's the most expendable among the current roster, while also being someone who could potentially be of interest to another team. There are teams out there who might benefit from Schneider's left-handed bat. There are organizations that might view him as a useful piece. So if and when Eloy Jimenez forces his way onto the opening day roster through sheer performance, Schneider could very well be involved in a trade to make the math work. This whole situation is a perfect example of how unpredictable spring training can be. Front offices enter the spring with a pretty clear vision of who their opening day roster is going to be. They think they have all the pieces in place, they think they know their lineup, and then out of nowhere, One guy shows up having completely transformed himself, playing at a level that demands attention, putting up numbers and exit velocities that cannot be ignored, and suddenly all the careful planning and all the roster construction looks like it might need a complete overhaul. It's chaos, but it's the kind of chaos that could actually be really good for the Blue Jays if they handle it right. The bottom line is this. The Toronto Blue Jays signed Eloy Jimenez to a minor league deal expecting very little. They got a feel-good story and a low-risk flyer on a guy trying to resurrect his career. And what they've received instead is a guy who has completely transformed himself and who is now forcing the organization to make some of the most difficult roster decisions they've faced in quite some time. The next month is absolutely critical. Every spring training at-bat, every home run, every hard-hit baseball is going to provide more evidence about whether this is sustainable or if it's all going to evaporate once the real games start counting. But based on everything we're seeing so far, based on the advanced metrics, based on the exit velocities, based on his own attitude and work ethic, Eloy Jimenez looks like the real deal. And if that's true, the Blue Jays better figure out quickly how they're going to make room for him, because keeping him off the opening day roster when he's playing at this level would be one of the biggest mistakes the organization could possibly make. This is baseball at its finest, folks. This is a sport where dreams can still come true if you're willing to work for them. This is a place where a guy who was nearly finished can come back and be a centerpiece of a major league roster. This is why we love this game, and this is a story that we're all going to be following incredibly closely as opening day approaches. Thank you so much for watching this deep dive into one of the most fascinating developments of spring training. If you enjoyed this breakdown, please smash that like button for the YouTube algorithm. Drop a comment down below telling us what you think is going to happen with Eloy Jimenez and the Blue Jays. Are you team add him to the opening day roster or team keep him in AAA for now? This is exactly the kind of discussion we love having with our community. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, because we're going to be covering every twist and turn as this situation develops. Spring training is just getting started, and opening day is less than a month away. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss a single update. Thanks again for the incredible support, you absolute legends. We'll see you in the next video. Let's go, Blue Jays.